Do you treasure what you have, or does your treasure have you? Let me ask this another way. Do you own your stuff, or does your stuff own you? Yeah, I think we all agree that we live in an age where we have a lot of stuff. We have stuff at home, we have stuff at work, we have stuff in the car, but how do we know how much stuff we really have? How do we get our mind around how much stuff we actually have in our lives? Yeah, I saw some statistics this week that I think help make sense of this for us. But the statistic I saw that over the last 50 years, the average home size has nearly tripled. That in the average American household, there are 300,000 items. So go home and count, see how many you got. 300,000. It said that homes with two-car garages, 1 out of 4, 25% of homes with two-car garages can't even park one car in the garage because all of their stuff. And another third can only park one car. We have a lot of stuff. I saw another statistic this week that might not surprise you, but it said that in America, there are more than 50,000 storage units, storage facilities. 50,000. To add some color to that, that is 4 storage facilities for every McDonald's in America. It seems like there's a McDonald's on every corner. We have a lot of stuff. We buy our stuff. We build bigger houses to store our stuff. We pack our garages with stuff. And then when our garage is full, we rent a storage unit and store our stuff there. We have a lot of stuff. The question I think we have to ask is, since we have so much stuff and we seem so devoted to it, do we own stuff, or does stuff actually own us? I think we've all heard that funny saying that you can't take your stuff with you when you die. You've never seen a hearse pulling a U-Haul. And I believed that until I saw this picture. It seems like we're trying everything we can now to take our stuff with us. In 1922, a man by the name of Howard Carter, he was an archaeologist. He discovered one of the most influential archaeological finds in history. He discovered the tomb of King Tut. If you guys know about King Tut, he was a famous pharaoh, and his tomb had been lost for 3,300 years. He was 17 years old when he died, and when Howard Carter and his team found the tomb of King Tut, not only was he found in this sarcophagus, inlaid in gold, he was found to have more than 5,000 objects in his tomb. He had gold and jewelry and gold inlaid statues and everything you can imagine. He had the new iPhone 12 Max Pro. I mean, he had everything. See, the Egyptians believed that you could take stuff with you into the afterlife, that what you treasured you could take on. And so they filled their sarcophaguses, they filled their tombs with all of their treasure and all of their good stuff, but yet here's Howard Carter finding it 3,300 years later, and guess what? It's all still there. Now, I think all of us, if we're being honest, we know we can't take stuff with us when we go. That the stuff we accumulate here on this earth, it's not going to go with us to heaven, but don't we live like we do? Don't we live like we think that sometimes? Doesn't it seem like we're living a life of trying to build up a treasure here on earth, even though we know we can't take it with us, but we live like we think we can? We're trying to get our arms around stuff and treasure because we think it's going to make us happy, or we think it's going to fulfill us, or we think it's going to make us feel satisfied. And then when that thing doesn't do it, what do? We fall for the lie that the next thing will. And we believe that at some point we'll just get our arms around enough stuff that's going to make us happy. So we build bigger houses, we fill our garages, we rent storage units. But let's be honest, it never truly satisfies, does it? Stuff never truly meets that need. So I guess the question we have to ask ourselves is, why do we keep getting on the hamster wheel? Why do we keep spinning and spinning and spinning and living the same day over and over? Because like Groundhog's Day, over and over again. And we have to ask the question, is this what life was supposed to be like? Is this what we were created to do? To just live and accumulate stuff and try to add something else? Is that what fills us up? Is this how the abundant life that Jesus says he came to bring is supposed to be? And I think if we asked Jesus, he would say, no. That the chase for treasure is not what life was to be about. Because what happens when you chase treasure, it traps you in and it holds you back. And according to Jesus, we miss one of the greatest opportunities that we'll ever have in our lives. See, according to Jesus, that we were created to live a life not to collect treasure for ourselves, but rather to send treasure ahead. If you have your Bibles, I want to camp out in Matthew chapter 6 this morning. We'll be in Matthew chapter 6, verse 19 through 24, and we've been walking through the Sermon on the Mount and seeing how Jesus is telling us to live this kingdom life, to be kingdom men, to be kingdom women, to be people that put the kingdom first. And he's going to tell us about how to build kingdom treasure in Matthew 6, verses 19 through 24. So let's read together. Here's what Jesus says. He says in Matthew 6, verse 19, "Do not lay up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Verse 22, "The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness?" And notice verse 24, what he says. He says, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other." Jesus says that you cannot serve God and money. Forefront, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Do you notice what Jesus is saying here? Are you catching that? Jesus is saying here that we need to be careful where we're storing our treasure, because where we store our treasure reveals to us whether we have treasure or if treasure has us. And he gives us these three pictures. If you notice here in 19 through 24, he kind of illustrates this with us by giving us three comparisons. He says you compare two treasures, two visions, and two masters. And we're going to reorder these a little bit to see how it impacts our own life. But I think Jesus is asking us three questions. And the first one is this. He's asking us, what are we looking at? What do we spend our time looking at? Because what we look at determines our treasure. Look back at verse 22 with me here. He says this in verse 22. He says, "The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness?" And Jesus is using an everyday comparison between somebody who can see well and somebody who is blind, or somebody who has trouble with their vision. And so think about how your vision works. When you can see clearly, you walk outside and you can see the world around you. You can see yourself in the mirror. You can have a good understanding of everything that is around you. But if you've ever had any eye challenges before, or you've had your vision wane and you had to go get glasses, and you're waiting on your glasses to get here, you know it's hard to see. You could be like me at home at night when my part-time job is to turn lights off at home. And I'm walking through the kids' room, the basement, trying to turn lights off, and there's always a Barbie head or an LOL doll or a marble or something that you step on and just destroys your foot. You just can't see around you what's on the ground. And the same happens for us in life, I think. When our eyes are not healthy, when what we're looking at is not what we're supposed to be focusing on, when we're focused on stuff, it clouds our vision. When materialism kind of grips us and all we do is see what we want next, to see what we can get our hands around next, we have a hard problem of seeing the world around us, and specifically, we have a hard time of seeing ourselves. There's this really cool story I read this week about a place in India. It's called Punjab. It's in northern India. And Punjab is only 100 miles away from the Himalayan mountains. A beautiful place, but because of smoke, because of smog, because of pollution, the people who live in Punjab have not been able to see the Himalayas for 30 years. For 3 decades, they have not been able to see the snow-capped peaks of one of the most beautiful mountain ranges in the world. Why not? Because they've let something get in the way. There's something hanging in the sky that blocks their vision. See, what Jesus is saying here is that this problem with greed and this desire for stuff and this chase for treasure, it just isn't a heart issue. It's an eye issue. It's a sin of the eye. Have you ever noticed that nobody thinks they're materialistic? Like, just go out and ask your friend, hey buddy, are you materialistic? Do you struggle with greed? Of course they're going to say no. We're all going to say no. None of us see ourselves as being materialistic. Yet we have stuff filling up our garages and filling up our storage units and online Amazon shopping carts full of stuff. But no, we're not materialistic. I don't struggle with that. Not me. There's this scene in Luke chapter 12 where Jesus is talking to the crowd, and there's a man who yells from the crowd. He says, "Hey, teacher, tell my brother to divide our father's inheritance with me." And Jesus comes back with just a classic Jesus answer. He calls back to that man, and instead of saying, "Hey, take care of your own house," or "Go have a conversation with your brother," he says this. He says, "Watch out. Be on guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist of an abundance of possessions." Why does Jesus tell us to be on guard? Why do we need to watch out from this? Because I think Jesus is saying that when greed and materialism and this love for treasure sneaks in the way, it clouds our vision. We don't see how it impacts me. I can see how it impacts you just fine, but I don't see how it impacts me at all. I don't see myself that way. Have you ever thought about it like this? I think one of the reasons that none of us think of ourselves as materialistic or struggle with this chase for treasure is that not only do we not see it in ourselves, we see it in other people. Have you ever thought about it like this? Every one of us knows somebody that makes twice as what we make. So we don't think of ourselves as greedy or materialistic because we know somebody who makes more than we do and has nicer things than we have. But have you ever thought about the fact that those people know somebody who makes twice or 3 times as much as they do? See, they don't think that they're materialistic or greedy either because they have somebody else they're looking at. See, when we're always looking at other people and not looking at ourselves, we miss the fact that maybe materialism and greed have snuck in and are clouding our vision. So here's the test. Ask yourself, do I struggle with this? Do I struggle with materialism or greed? And if your answer is no, that's not my problem, then it may be a problem. I think we need to ask ourselves those diagnostic tests. So I think Jesus is asking us, what are we looking at? What do you spend our time looking at? What are you thinking about when you go to bed at night? What are you looking at when you wake up in the morning? What are you browsing for online? When you go to the mall, what are you going there to see? Because what we're looking at is clouding our vision. It's being like smog and pollution in our eyes. Really cool story about that state in India, in Punjab. This year, when the shutdown happened in March, by the early April, enough smog lifted they could finally see the mountains. For the first time in three decades, they could see the Himalayan mountains right in front of them. I think what Jesus is saying for us is we got to lift the smog. We got to lift the pollution. We got to get it out of our life. We got to quit looking at stuff we don't need to look at because it's drawing our heart away from Jesus. So Jesus is saying here that what are you looking at? Check yourself. Check your heart. Make sure you're not looking at the wrong things. But second question he asks us is this. Who's calling the shots in your life? So you have to be aware of what you're looking at, but you also have to be aware of who's calling the shots. Who's making the decisions? Who's your boss? Look what he says in verse 24 about who's calling the shots. He says this. He says in verse 24 that no one can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. Jesus says that you cannot serve God and money. He says that there's this connection, this tie-in, this link between our hearts and our treasure. So you find what you treasure. Jesus says you're going to find your heart right there with it. Now, your Bible may say something different for money here. Anybody say mammon? Anybody's Bible translation say mammon? It can be translated other ways. The mammon's actually, this is pretty cool, a little history lesson. Mammon's an Aramaic word. So scholars believe that Jesus spoke Aramaic. And so mammon would have been the word that Jesus would have used there. And a lot of translations leave mammon in because mammon conveys this idea. It's not just money. Mammon is wealth, it's riches, it's material goods. It's this full blanket idea of stuff that draw our heart away. I like the translation to money, though, because I think that does a good job of conveying most of what we struggle with, because most of it, money buys what we're looking for. And so Jesus is saying that you can't actually serve both money and God. You can't actually serve both God and stuff. It just doesn't work. It's really interesting. Jesus, in the Gospels, talks about money a lot. He talks about money 15% of the time. That would be like if we preached on money here 8 times a year. You guys would be like, man, these guys talk about money a lot. So Jesus talks about money 15% of the time. He talks about money more than he does relationships. He talks about money more than he talks about heaven. Why so much? Why does Jesus spend so much time talking about money? I think it's this. It's not because Jesus needs our money. Everything is his. It's because Jesus knows that strain that money can have on your heart. This is why he says in verse 21 that there's this link between heart and treasure. That there's this tie-in, that they're linked together. He says you can't serve both. One of them is going to be the boss. One of them is going to call the shots. There's a really cool story in Mark chapter 10, the rich young ruler. Some of you have read it before. So there's a rich young ruler, a young man with a lot of wealth, that comes up to Jesus and he says, Jesus, teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says to him, well, you need to keep the commandments. You need to honor God. You need to honor your mother and your father. You don't steal. Don't covet. Those kind of things. And he's like, I've done all these things. I've done it all. And Jesus knows his heart. He says, okay, now go sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and come and follow me. And if you guys know the story, the guy walks away not just sad, not just bummed, but grieving. He walks away grieving, like there's this loss in his life because money had become his boss. That money had mastered him. And so now he's really upset because he can't follow Jesus. And I don't think Jesus is making a blanket statement about money or possessions here. I don't think he's saying that stuff is bad. I think what Jesus is saying here is this specifically was a problem for this man. And for this man to follow Jesus, he had to get rid of whatever that idol or that master was in his life. But the principle stands for us. If we've allowed stuff to become our boss, then it's impossible to truly follow Jesus with all of our heart. When money is calling the shots, it blocks you from truly following Jesus. Yet I would bet for a lot of us, we find ourselves kind of straddling the line. I think for a lot of Christians, I just think for a lot of Christians, a lot of us, we find ourselves trying to do both and thinking that we have enough power to kind of manage it. We say, well, God, I want to follow you. God, I want you to speak into my life. God, I want to live by the words that you've given me and do my best to be the man or the woman you've called me to be. But yet we allow money to still call the shots a little bit. We allow money to still be our boss. Think of how this works in your life. Maybe you feel like God was calling you to do something. You feel like God was calling you to go on that mission trip. You feel like God was calling you to give generously to somebody or to something, and you got really excited about that. And then the first thing that came to mind was, can I afford it? Can I afford to actually do this? Now, just make sure you guys know, I'm not saying that we just need to be reckless. Jesus would not condone us putting a mission trip on the Discover card. But I think what Jesus is saying is, when our first question is, can I afford it, then are we missing the picture? Rather than asking Jesus, is this what you're calling me to do? We're asking Jesus, can I afford it? Is money our boss? Is money calling the shot in our life? So I think the question we have to discover is, what do we do then? If we look to ourselves, we see that money is the filter that we live through, that we process everything through, that money actually is calling the shot in our lives, then how do we jump that hurdle? Where do we go from here? And Jesus says that when we realize that we have the chase for treasure in our hearts, we've allowed money to call the shots, then we need to shift where we put our treasure. And when we do that, our heart will follow. Look what Jesus says here back in verse 19. Notice what he says about where we build our treasure. Not necessarily what we treasure at first, but where we build it. He says in verse 19, do not lay up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So Jesus is saying, where are you building your treasure? If you want to know if treasure has you or if you have treasure, Jesus says you find out by asking, where are you building it? Where are you putting it? See, Jesus links, again, money with our heart. And you might be sitting here thinking, well, I don't know. Do I struggle with this? Is treasure something that has me? Here's how you find out. You want to know what you treasure? You look at your Visa statement. You want to know what you treasure? You look at what you're spending your money on. You look at your bank statement. That will tell you better than anything else will what it is you're treasuring in life. See, Jesus is not telling us that treasures are wrong. Jesus is not telling us that we need to sell everything and give it to the poor, that we can't have nice things, that we can't have fun trips, that we can't have good things at home, that we can't drive good cars. Jesus isn't saying any of that. What Jesus is just saying is that those treasures don't last. So why would you put your hope in those things? That those treasures don't make it. Jesus is saying that cars get rusty, that houses fall apart, that your clothes will get eaten by moths. And if it makes it through all those things, Jesus says, even if you have an ADT system, at some point somebody's going to come in and steal it. Like, it's just impossible to keep this stuff. This stuff doesn't last. There's nothing wrong with it, but you just can't keep it. It's like what Solomon says in the book of Ecclesiastes. He says, you can work your whole life amassing as much treasure as you can, and then when you die, it goes to somebody else, and you don't even get to decide who gets to spend it. So what's the point, Solomon says? It's all vanity at the end of the day. So Jesus is trying to get us away from spending our lives chasing stuff and treasure, and then looking back at the end of our lives going, man, I wasted my time. I wasted my treasure. I wasted my effort. Solomon, before he lost his mind, says this in Proverbs 23. He says, do not toil to acquire wealth. Be discerning enough to desist. We don't use that word enough, do we? Desist. That's a good word. When your eyes light on it, you're seeing something that you want. He says, when your eyes light on it, it is gone. For suddenly, listen to this, it sprouts wings and flying like an eagle towards heaven. So Solomon's kind of saying, hey, when you see something you want, just imagine it sprouting wings and flying away, right? You want that new car? Just at some point, it's going to sprout wings and it's going to fly away. You want that new phone? It's going to sprout wings and fly away. You want the new house? That might not sprout wings and fly away, but you guys get the idea. But when our treasure's in heaven, it sprouts wings and it flies to heaven. It's this beautiful picture. And so Jesus is saying, whatever you have your eyes set on, whatever you're chasing, is it something that you can build in heaven, or is it something you're building here on earth? Have you guys ever been to an estate sale? Anybody ever been to an estate sale? If you have, two of you have, that's good. They're not that much fun. I'll just be honest with you. I went to an estate sale one time. Courtney bought me a toolbox for Christmas, and I needed some tools. So I went to an estate sale one time, and it was a really tough moment because I'm walking around the front yard of this couple that had just passed away, and I'm seeing all of their treasures. I'm seeing just all of the things they've collected over their lives sitting on tables throughout their house and throughout their yard. And here we are bidding on them. 10, 20, 15, 18, whatever. But what happens when those things don't get purchased? What happens to them? They go to Goodwill, or they get thrown in the trash. So all the things we work for, Jesus is telling us right now, don't let them get thrown away. Don't invest in them or spend your time hoping that they're going to be in something that lasts, because none of it lasts. See, look what Jesus says in verse 20. He says, but when you store your heaven, when you build your treasure, when you store your treasure in heaven, when you build your treasure in heaven, you won't have this problem. There's no moss. There's no rust. There's no thieves. Heaven's the place that it can last forever. So Jesus says our hearts are linked to what we treasure, and our hearts will follow what we treasure. So where you build your treasure matters. When you build it on earth, your heart's going to follow. When you build it in heaven, your heart will follow too. So Jesus is saying, make sure you're investing in the right place. In high school, my business teacher, his name was Mr. DeVore, and he told this story about going into an investment meeting. He and a group of business leaders got invited to an investment meeting in Missouri, and they're sitting across the table from this guy who is trying to pitch a $5,000 investment to open a retail chain. And so the guy across from him had a cowboy hat on, had a big old wad of chew in his mouth, and just looked like a mess. Cowboy boots that he just walked out of the pig trough with. And he's asking them for $5,000 each. And Mr. DeVore, my marketing teacher, said he walked out thinking, no way. Why would I ever give that guy $5,000? He said, do you want to go to that guy's name? And of course, we're like, yeah, who is it? It was Bud Walton, Sam Walton's brother. And if Mr. DeVore would have invested $5,000 right then, he would have over $74 million right now. See, he made a $74 million mistake because he was thinking of his own and not seeing the opportunity ahead of him. I think Jesus is telling you and I, don't make the same mistake. And that the mistake that we can make by investing in our little kingdom, by trying to build our little treasure chest, is much more than a $74 million mistake. Because we have an opportunity to invest in the kingdom of heaven and to invest in what God is doing right now. I love this quote by Randy Alcorn. He wrote a book called The Treasure Principle, and here's what he says. He says, whatever we gain on earth, he says, you can't take it with you, but you can send it on ahead. So the treasure that we have been given, what God has given us, whether small, medium, or large, we can't take it with us no matter what, but we can send it ahead. We can invest it in God's kingdom. So let's not make that $74 million mistake or worse. If you ever have met with a financial planner, your financial planner will tell you need to play the long game, right? Don't invest for 3 years, but invest for 30 years. But I think what Jesus is telling us, don't invest for 30 years, invest in 30 million years. What would you be glad you did 30 million years from now? What investment can you make that's going to make a difference for 30 million years? Jesus is saying, go and make that investment. Because I think what Jesus is wanting us to get at is 5 minutes after we die, 5 minutes after we close our eyes that last time and we wake up, if we know Jesus, we wake up with him in heaven, what are we going to wish we invested in? What are we going to wish we used our treasure for? It's a great parable in Matthew chapter 14 about the man who finds the treasure in the field. Notice what he says. Jesus says this. He says, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it and covered it up, then in his joy he went and sold all that he had to buy that field. See, Jesus is saying when you find treasure that lasts, you do everything you can to have that treasure. You do everything you can to keep that treasure forever. And the reality is that you and I, we have the most amazing treasure that we could ever imagine. That you and I, because if you know Jesus Christ, we have the most amazing treasure that you could ever get your hands wrapped around. And that treasure isn't here and now. That treasure is waiting for us one day. I love what Peter says in 1 Peter 1, verse 3. He says this. He says, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his great mercy has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to obtain an inheritance which is imperishable, undefiled, and will not fade away, reserved in heaven for you. See, our treasure is waiting for us in heaven. And Jesus is telling us, let's let other people get in on that too. Let's let other people experience that same treasure that we're going to get to experience in our lives. So Jesus is saying, don't miss it. Don't miss out on what God is doing because we're too busy trying to chase our own treasure. Just imagine for a moment that you've got the eternal history, right? History past to history forward. History is like a line, a linear line that just runs the length of the page. You got the beginning of history, Garden of Eden, you got the birth of Jesus, and you've got this beautiful new heaven and new earth. This is eternity that as Christians we look forward to. Just imagine this line. The reality is that the 70 or 80 years that you and I get, if we're lucky, if we're blessed, is just a little dot on that line. It's just a little teeny little dot on that line. And so I think Jesus is saying to us, do you want to invest in the dot or do you want to invest in the line? Because when we build our treasure here on earth, we're just investing in the dot. But when we send it forward, when we send our treasure ahead, we're investing in the line, what God is doing, what God's going to do, and how God is going to change the world. So how do we build treasure in the right place? How do we build this treasure in the right place? 3 quick just takeaways. If you're taking notes, just 3 quick ideas. Here's how we do it. We have to shift our mind from seeing our treasure to seeing God's. And so 3 simple ways we can build treasure. And as we talk about these real quick, I'm just going to hit them really quickly. I just challenge you to do one of these each this month. Out of these 3 things, to do this once, just over this next month, and just try this. And what you're going to see is that God, as you begin to invest in the line, as you begin to invest in his kingdom, you're going to see God use your heart and make your heart follow your treasure. So first one is this, just give generously. And God calls us to, all throughout the scripture, to give generously. Not because God needs our money, but because God knows that when we give generously, something happens to us. That something changes inside of us. You know, in the Old Testament, God gave the principle of tithing to his people, to give that first 10% to God. And when you gave that first 10% to God, it changed your heart to live on the rest. And so it put God first, and you invested in God's kingdom first. Now, for some of us, it's been a really hard year, a really challenging time, and we just aren't at a point where we can do that. But I think the question for us is, God, how do we begin to take steps to give generously? How do we begin to do things, to live generously? Because we end up being so tight-fisted when we're chasing our treasure. Jesus wants us to learn to live like this, open-handed. So what do we do? How do we do that? I think that's a prayer between you and God. God, help me learn to give and to live generously. For some of us, that may mean that we go from 0 to 1%. We start just saying, God, I'm going to give 1%. And I'm just going to let you work. And I'm going to let you shape me and sculpt me through doing that. For other people who may be already giving, maybe it's adding 1%. Maybe you are tithing and you're giving that first 10% to God. Could God be asking you just to do something over and above? Maybe there's a charity or a ministry or a missionary that God's calling you to give generously to. When we give generously, something happens to our heart. Giving moves our focus from our treasure to God's. So I think God tells us over and over to give generously and our heart will follow. But not just that. When we're building treasure in heaven, it's not just about money. I think Jesus also tells us this. He says, show Jesus by serving. Show Jesus by serving. Show Jesus to other people by serving other people. One of the things that I think you guys know this is true. When we're chasing after our own treasure, what we're trying to do is we don't want people to steal our time because our time needs to be devoted to my treasure. But when we start serving other people, we're giving our time away. And Jesus is going to bless that. You know, there's opportunities right now for you to serve other people, especially the Christmas season. This holiday season, there's going to be a ton of opportunities. Sign up to give somebody a turkey. We've got a coat drive around the corner. Let's go through our closets. Let's get out and let's rake our neighbor's leaves. Let's do something to show Jesus to somebody by giving away our time. But also, I think the last thing that helps stack treasure in heaven so our heart follows is this. We share Jesus with somebody in our circle. You might ask, what is this treasure in heaven that God is talking about? What is this treasure in heaven that Jesus is telling us to put forward and to build? And part of that is people. Part of that is people that came to know Jesus because of you, because of the investment you made in the line, because of the service you gave them by showing them Jesus, and because you told them about the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. See, the reality is Jesus has placed you in a circle of influence around your friends, around your coworkers, around your family, around your neighbors. And he's opened the door to use you to tell them about him. See, our mission here at Forefront is to help people find their way back to God. And when we step out and we share Jesus, we are building our treasure in heaven. So here's my challenge to you. Over this next month, I challenge you guys to invite somebody to church, to talk about your faith, to stand over the fence row while you're talking to your neighbor or while you're raking leaves or whatever it is. You're walking the dog and get to know them. And you may say, I don't know my neighbors right now. Well, get to know them. Open that door. Invite them to Christmas Eve. Invite them to watch our live stream. Become friends with them on Facebook. But share Jesus. Because when we do, we're building treasure in heaven. I love this quote by C.S. Lewis, and we'll close with this. C.S. Lewis says this. He says, if you read history, you'll find the Christians who did most for this present world were precisely those who thought most of the next. And I think that's what Jesus is telling us to do by building our treasure, by sending it ahead, is we need to live fully engaged in this life, but man, we need to be fully focused on the next. And because of Jesus, because of what he's done for us, because Jesus stepped out of heaven and gave his life for us generously, because Jesus came and served us, because Jesus told us that he is the way, the truth, and the life, we have life eternal. We've been set on the path for the life that Jesus has created us to live, and he just tells us to help other people get there too. And we do that by sending our treasures ahead. Not so we can try to build castles made out of sand that Jimi Hendrix so notably tells us fall into the sea eventually, but so that we can point people to the castles in heaven. Let's pray together.